Welcome to today's session on abnormal psychology. Module 2, session. We will start with a quick recap. In the previous session, we learned about three levels of consciousness. By the end of today's session, students will be able to understand the structure of personality and its application. The structure of personality consists of three elements, that is, id, ego, and superego. According to Freud, psychoanalytical theory, the id is the primitive and instinctual part of the mind that contains sexual and aggressive drives and hidden memories. The superego operates as a moral conscience, and the ego is the realistic part that mediates between the desires of the id and superego. Firstly, we will talk about id. The id is the primitive and instinctive component of personality. It consists of all the inherited components of personality present at birth, including sex instinct and aggressive instinct. The id is the impulsive part of our psyche which responds directly and immediately to basic urges, needs, and desires. The personality of the newborn child is all id, and only later does it develop an ego and superego. The id remains infantile and its function throughout a person's life and does not change with time or experience, as it is not in touch with the external world. The id is not affected by reality, logic, or the everyday world as it operates within the unconscious part of the mind. The id operates on the pleasure principle, which is the idea that every wishful impulse without being satisfied immediately, regardless of the consequences. When the id achieves its demands, we experience pleasure. When it is denied, we experience unpleasure or tension. The id engages in primary process thinking, which is primitive, illogical, irrational, and fantasy oriented. This form of process thinking has no comprehension of objective reality and is self and wishful in nature. Talking about ego, it is the part of the id which has been modified by direct influence of the external world. The ego develops to mediate between the unrealistic id and the external real world. It is the decision making component of personality. Ideally, the ego works by reason, whereas the id is chaotic and unreasonable. The ego operates according to the reality principle, working out realistic ways of satisfying the its demands, often compromising or postponing satisfaction to avoid negative consequences of society. The ego considers social realities and norms, etiquette and rules in deciding how to behave. If the ego fails in its attempt to use the reality principle and anxiety is experienced, unconscious defense mechanisms are employed to help ward off unpleasant feelings, that is, anxiety, or make good things feel better for the individual. The ego engages in secondary process thinking, which is rational, realistic, and oriented towards problem solving. If a plan of action does not work, then it is thought through again until a solution is found. This is known as reality testing and enables the person to control their impulses and demonstrate self control via mastery of the ego. An important feature of clinical and social work is to enhance ego functioning and help the client test reality through assistance the client to think through their options. Finally, talking about superego, it is the function to control its impulses, especially those which society forbids, such as sex and aggression. It also has the function of persuading the ego to turn to moralistic goals rather than simply realistic ones and to strive for perfection. The superego consists of two systems, the conscience and the ideal self. The conscience can push the ego through causing feelings of guilt. For example, if the ego gives in to the its demands, the superego may make the person feel bad through guilt. The ideal self is an imaginary picture of how you ought to be and represents career aspirations, how to treat other people, and how to behave as a member of society. Behavior which falls short of ideal self may be punished by the superego through guilt. The superego can also reward us through the ideal self when we behave properly by making us feel proud. If a person's ideal self is too high a standard, then whatever the person does will represent failure. The ideal self and conscience are largely determined in childhood from parental values and how we are brought up. Summarizing the session, we have covered the structure of personality described by Freud, the three parts of personality, that is the id, ego, and superego. Here are some references to get further information. Thank you.